This is Vandana Shiva, and you're listening to the Enviro show. Remember, listen to your mother.
Greetings, Earthlings. It's the Trees on Beacon Hill Enviro Show, and I am one of your co-hosts, Dio, and I, once again, am not in the studio with...
I'm Glenn Ayers, and welcome to the Enviro Show.
Yes, and the official tour, Glenn, of the Massachusetts State House only mentions a line of poplars was planted along the west property line. And all the rest of the site is only devoted to statues, plaques, and the building itself. Well, I don't know. There may be some other internet site or brochure out there that deals with the landscaping of Beacon Hill, but what about the business of legislation and legislating in relation to trees? There are a host of bills that address just that. For instance, Massachusetts Forest Protection Bill, H.3333, would designate all 412,000 acres of park, forest, and watershed lands administered by the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation as parks or reserves, while H.102 or 1002 would expand and make permanent the existing system of reserves on public wildlife management areas administered by the Massachusetts Division of Fishery and Wildlife. Also, with regard to dirty biomass, H.3333, an act to prevent biomass energy to protect the air we breathe, that's in there too. And Janet Sinclair of Save Massachusetts Forests and David Meshoulam, Executive Director and co-founder of Speak for the Trees Boston, supporting H.905 and S.504, an act establishing the municipal reforestation program, joins us to see the forest for the trees here on the Enviro Show. Okay, we have a quote of the week. You ready for that?
Yes.
You better stop now. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going. You better stop. Children, what's that
sound? Our Enviro Show quote of the week calls, well, just for a brief hop into the Wayback Machine. And it also touches on our theme on today's show. Quote, revolution is about the need to re-evolve political, economic, and social justice and power back into the hands of the people, preferably through legislation and policies that make human sense. That's what revolution is about. Revolution is not about shootouts, close quote. And that comes from Bobby Seale, Black Panther from the back in the day.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that takes us to our interviews. No?
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into the guests that we have on the show today, talking about legislation right here in Massachusetts. Really important legislation for a number of reasons, and they'll get into that, the reasons for this legislation. But we want to focus on what our listeners can do, what action people can take, because remember, the antidote to despair is action. So don't despair, take action. And our folks that we have on the show this week will tell you how to take action, how to get involved, how to plug in, and how to bring these important proposed pieces of legislation over the finish line. We really want to see this enacted. It's time, and all of this fits in with what we've talked about on the show for a long time. And that's forest protection and environmental protection, and also the climate emergency. So let's get into those interviews.
Right. Remember that little cliche from the 80s, don't mourn, organize.
Yes. So today on the Enviro Show, we are joined by Janet Sinclair, who is an awesome activist, organizer in Western Mass, specifically around issues related to protection of forests. I've known Janet for many years, and you work closely with Michael Kellett from Restore the North Woods, and the two of you put together some proposed legislation that is directed at protecting our publicly owned forests, a lot of which exist in Western Mass here. And specifically, these pieces of proposed legislation would require or target the DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, land to be managed more like a national park is managed. And since we have no national park here in Massachusetts, our state lands have to provide that function, to the population, unless you want to drive up to Maine or, some other area. Even a lot of people think of the White Mountains and the Green Mountain National Forest as sort of being like national parks, but they're not. They're not treated the same way. The forests there are not treated the same way as national parks are. So Janet, welcome to the Enviro Show. And if you could explain a little bit about this proposed legislation, and then how folks can follow the legislation, how they can get it plugged into this process, and give us an update on what the status of the legislation is in the state legislature in this session, and how folks can get involved and what to look forward to, over the next month or two.
Well, thank you, Glenn and Dio, for having me here with you today. Glenn, I think you gave a great description of generally what we would like to do in Massachusetts, because we don't have any land that's really protected in the same way that our national parks are protected. So with the two bills that we have, one of them is to basically expand these reserved forests, such as Mohawk Trail State Forest. We have these reserve areas already. And so what we're doing is basically saying, let's expand those reserves and let's make them permanent. Likewise, on the fish and wildlife land, there are reserves on those lands as well. And in that case, we're asking for 30% of those lands to be basically protected like forever wild, and also to make them permanent as well. So now our bills are going to be heard by the committee in the legislature called Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture. And you can find all of this on our website, savemassforest.com. And what we're asking people to do is specifically to call the chairs of this committee, Representative Dykema and Chair Senator Roush. It's all on the website. And to call them and write to them and just say that you're supporting these two bills. We also would love it if people would write to their own, write or call their own lawmakers, legislators, and ask them to endorse these bills if they haven't already, and also ask them to call the chairs of NRA. And also, it would be great if our sponsors, Rep. Mike Finn and Rep. Sabadosa, which are all on the website, to write and call them and thank them for sponsoring these bills. We do have a letter that we're putting together for organizations to support these bills, and we'll be submitting that to the NRA committee. Glenn, do you want me to tell you who's been signing on to this letter?
Yeah, it'd be great to know the depth or breadth of the support, what groups are involved in this effort. And let me just quickly mention that the bill, one bill that we're talking about, and the bills have an H or an S if it's the House or the Senate, and the bill we're talking about is H.3333. That's the bill that would address the lands that are under the management of the DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation. And the other bill is H.1002, and that would be the one that addresses the lands under the management of the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. So those are the two bills. But again, all of that is on that website. But yeah, if you
Right.
would go down the list of groups that have signed on to support this legislation, that'd be great.
I'll just name some because we actually have quite a few. Well, Massachusetts Sierra Club, the Partnership for Policy Integrity. We have Friends of Peru State Forest, Climate Action Now, Berkshire's 350. We have Friends of the Middlesex Fells Reservation, the Thoreau Society, Green Berkshires, Walden Woods Project, the Rewilding Institute, that's in Amherst, the Endangered Species Coalition, you can tell me when to stop, Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, the Old Growth Forest Network, Elders Climate Action in Massachusetts, Massachusetts Forest Watch, the Enviro Show, Save the Pine Barrens, Arise for Social Justice in Springfield, as well as the Springfield Climate Justice Coalition. We also have scientists that are signing on. We have Standing Trees Vermont signing on because people in our neighboring states are very interested in what we're doing here. Amherst Sunrise Movement, the Nashua River Watershed Association. There are more.
Okay, well that's a pretty good
I'm
list.
sorry. I was going to let you stop me whenever you wanted.
That's a pretty good list. I think it's important to note that there are also a lot of legislators who have signed on, co-sponsored this legislation as well. And that's also important to get a bill through the legislature, but that folks should contact their own senator and representative to make sure that they have signed on. And even if they have, to thank them for sponsoring the legislation or co-sponsoring the legislation, and to ask them to support it, to push it, not just to put their name on something, but to actually work towards the passage of the legislation during this legislative session.
Right, and the way that those legislators can help is by them contacting the chairs and vice chairs of NRA. They know how to do that. But yes, we want these co-sponsors. Each bill has about 25 co-sponsors, and if those co-sponsors would take an active role by contacting NRA, that would be great.
And another thing to point out is that our local representative, at least here in Greenfield and in the Berkshires further west, is Paul Mark, Representative Paul Mark, who is an awesome guy. And he's my representative, and I like him a lot. And he is also very influential because he's a member of ENRA, the Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture Committee. He sits on that committee, and so he can be influential in that way. And also, it turns out that he is running for state senate in the upcoming elections. And so that's another reason why he should be interested in making his constituents happy by sponsoring legislation that would benefit, specifically this proposed legislation would have a huge benefit for Western Mass, because most of the state-owned lands are in Western Mass and in the Quabbin region. And so it really is important for Western Mass to get this legislation passed.
Janet, as you were going over the description of the bills, you mentioned reserves, that how the public lands would go into reserves. But I have a question. Reserves, as DCR defines them now, are only protected for 10 years. That's my understanding, at which point they can be logged again. So does your bill change that?
Yes, it does, and thanks for asking that. I think one of the things that we're thinking about here, when Michael Kellett and I were thinking a lot about these bills and all the history of everybody's activism here, is that the state already knows that they need these reserve areas, and so what we did was we thought about making the current definition of reserves a little better, we thought, and the process for dealing with them a little bit better, more transparent, and with public participation. But the importance of reserves is already understood by the state. But these reserve areas that we have now are just designated by an administrative procedure. They're not the law, they're not permanent. And so right now, while people might feel happy that we have these reserves, the reality is that they can be changed at any time and taken out of reserves. So it's very important for us to make these reserves permanent.
This may be a little too wonky for most folks, but let me just point out that the state is currently going through a process where they're developing something called the Clean Energy Climate Plan. And that's based on what they call their decarbonization roadmap study. And in that study, they claim that in order for the state to meet its climate goals under the newly passed Next Generation Climate Policy Roadmap bill in the state legislature, which was signed by the governor, and that says that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and everybody agrees to that. But we also have to take out of the atmosphere a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide. And the only mechanism we have to do that are forests. I mean, that's the real mechanism on the land that we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And so forests play a very critical role in removing CO2 from the atmosphere and locking it up in forests. And the state admits that. And so this legislation, I'm just trying to make the point that this legislation is totally in sync. It's very much in line with the stated policy of the Next Generation Roadmap bill to protect forests, to store carbon in our forests. And so this shouldn't be no one should be opposed to this legislation because it's really implementing this landmark law that was passed earlier this year to save the climate.
And Glenn, the other thing is, we didn't mention this yet, but, we do have this little fact sheets also on our website. And this whole idea of the climate crisis and our biodiversity crisis, this is so much of why we're asking for this action to be taken by Massachusetts, because our belief and understanding is that the best way to sequester carbon in our forests are to leave our forests intact and not be managing them. And the best way to protect native biodiversity native to our area is by having intact forests that are not managed. We don't have those right now. So this is the whole pro-forestation idea, right?
So Janet, in the time we have left, could you once again tell folks how to find out more information and give us just a brief expectation of what the next month or two are for this proposed legislation?
So the quickest way I would say to find out information about this is to go to savemassforest.com. You can email us by emailing savemassforest@gmail.com. The next potential legislative hearing on this, as far as I can tell, is December 7th. Another potential hearing is the 14th, and another one, I think it's January 4th. So hearings on these bills will be taking place in the next month or two. And so what we would love is for people to not wait for the hearings, to write or call now in support of these bills. And when it's time for the hearing to come around, if people can be there and be willing to submit testimony at the hearing, that would be great. But if somebody signs up for our email, I will be, just immediately sending out the hearing date as soon as I find out about it.
Great. And folks can sign up by going to your website, savemassforests.com?
Yes, they can sign up for our email list there.
Okay,
Yes.
great. We're big supporters of protecting forests. We talk about protecting forests on almost every show here on the Enviro show. We've been talking about it for
Forever.
Yeah, forever. Let's just say forever. We are watching this legislation, and we're going to be talking about some other legislation, on another part of this show. But we really hope that our listeners will take action on this. We're all about action, and so take some action now. Contact your legislators and look for the action alerts. Sign up and look for the action alerts for the hearing, because it's really important that people show up for these hearings to let the committees know that this is an important issue for Massachusetts. And then, we'll follow up with this after the hearing probably to see what's happening. And it's going to be after the hearing, then there's going to have to be a push to get the committee to release the legislation with what's called a favorable report, release it out. And then, hopefully it'll make it up to the full legislature for a vote in this session.
Right.
Yes, that would be our goal.
Yeah. So Janet, thanks again for being on the Enviro Show. Thanks for all of your activism around this issue. And I'm going to just say, on behalf of the forest, I'll pretend I'm the Lorax here, and I'll speak for the trees. And I'll say, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So as the LORAC says, you have to care about this. And so listeners, they need to take action. They need to care about it. And thanks, Janet, for your activism.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Janet.
Thank you both so much.
So today on the Enviro Show, we are really pleased to have two amazing tree activists who are working to pass a piece of legislation that is in the current session, and that is referred to as H.905, or the Senate version of that is S.504. So we're joined here today by Marilyn and David. And if you would both introduce yourselves, tell us what organizations you work with, and then tell us a little bit about this proposed legislation, which is, it's an urban reforestation bill, but you can tell us exactly what it is, what it'll do, and how can folks support the passage of this really important legislation. We are very supportive of it on this show. We previously had Senator Cream on, who is one of the sponsors of this legislation. So whoever wants to go first, introduce yourself, and then give us a little bit about this bill and how folks can get involved.
Hi, everybody. My name is Marilyn Smith. I'm an Access to Justice Fellow working with the Gas Leaks Allies, and I also represent the Emerald Necklace Conservancy and the Brookline Green Space Alliance on the Gas Leaks Allies, which is a group of about 30 organizations working to get rid of gas leaks and transition to fossil-free fuels. So you say, well, why do we care about trees? Well, many of the people who joined this group got there because gas leaks were killing trees. So that really made us aware of the fact that there's many urban deserts where there are not enough trees, and people have a heat island effect, and they have higher rates of asthma. They have, more difficulty with just going outside when it's really hot. And so we've worked closely with Senator Cream and Representative Lori Ehrlich in the past on gas legislation, and they asked us to come up with something on trees, because they also have many advocates who care about trees. And so I'm going to pass the baton to David to talk about what he's doing with the Speak for the Trees in Boston, and then we can come back and talk about the details of the bill.
Thanks, Marilyn. And Glenn, it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is David Meshoulam. A couple of years ago, co-founded a nonprofit in Boston called Speak for the Trees Boston, and I'm now executive director. And just real brief, we are an urban and community forestry nonprofit, and we really focus on trees as they relate to the people who live by them. So like Marilyn said, we see trees as an asset that enriches people's lives, gives them cleaner air, cooler air in the summer, gives mental benefits, immense mental benefits to, by reducing stress and actually reducing blood pressure. And in the era of climate change, we really need to figure out ways to not only mitigate the effects of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, but to adapt to a new climate. So this bill is, I think, a really critical step in helping municipalities across the Commonwealth focus on their urban forest and improve it. And I just want to say that Marilyn's been really spearheading a lot of this work and has done a tremendous job in ushering this along. And I'll let her speak a little bit to the process, but I want to also just say that the Commonwealth has been thinking about forestry and urban forestry for a long time now through the Greening the Gateway Cities program, which has done tremendous work in planting trees in gateway cities. And this bill is sort of taking that program as a model and thinking about how can we sort of replicate it throughout the state.
So there is already a program, as David said, called Greening the Gateway Cities, but that only 26 cities in the Commonwealth are eligible for that program as gateway cities. And so far they're only in 18 cities. And they've planted 30,000 trees. About 2/3 of them have been on private land. But we felt that it was really important to bring this to scale and to make it available to all the cities and towns in the Commonwealth, which have a wide variety of needs. Some of them are in the Western Mass, there are more trees, but people have town forests and people have concerns about what's going on with the state-owned forests. And then in the cities, there's a huge variety, even in some place like the city of Boston or Brookline, where I live, where some neighborhoods have lots and lots of trees and some neighborhoods have very few trees. And not surprisingly, there's a big income disparity that follows the trees. So the purpose of this bill is to create a structure and a funding mechanism run through the Secretary of Environmental Affairs because her office oversees not just the Department of Conservation and Recreation, but also the Department of Environmental Protection and a variety of other agencies that would be involved in this process. And it sets up a mechanism for the cities and towns to apply to the state to submit a plan. And it's actually mandatory. This is not like some of the other grant programs where it's up to the cities and towns to just decide if they want this. Every city and town would be required to submit a plan about what they would do to improve their street trees or their tree canopy, not just on public land, but also on private land. And also to make available resources so that they can figure out what are the right kind of trees to plant and what kind of neighborhood. And maybe there's some infrastructure work that needs to be done because there's hardscape gray infrastructure that needs to be dealt with. So in order to coordinate all of that, there needs to be some expertise. So the bill provides for Urban Forest Advisory Council, made up of a lot of different kind of experts, whether it's arboriculture, landscape architects, tree wardens, energy efficiency experts, just a wide variety that's up to the secretary to determine who would be there, but they would help cities and towns develop their plans and help them do their inventories and their canopy analysis and do the work that they need to make this go forward. Now, since there are 350 something cities and towns across the Commonwealth, there are priorities. So first priority is going to go to sites that have less than 20% tree canopy in their neighborhoods with high air pollution that are affecting health, environmental justice neighborhoods, and heat islands. So that's sort of the first kind of priority for plans. Then the second priority would go to sites that have less than 40% tree canopy cover. And then third priority for more than 60%. And the reason we have 60%, which is pretty high, is that the American Forest Association has determined that 60% is really what you need to have a robust tree canopy cover in an urban environment. And Massachusetts is, we're lucky, we're what's called a forested state. We have lots of trees that grow here easily as opposed to being in a desert state. So when you're in a forested state, you really can get to 60%. And the tree-lined neighborhoods where the more affluent people live are certainly at 60%. And so it really is looking at across the board in the communities.
I just want to say that I'm very active with the Greenfield Tree Committee here in Greenfield, Mass, which is in the Connecticut River Valley. And I found out about this bill and I read it and I was blown away by the amount of thought that was clearly put in writing this legislation. It is an 11 or 12 page piece of legislation. And I mentioned when we did an interview with Senator Cream, I mentioned that this, from my experience, is very unusual to have a very well-written piece of legislation that clearly lays out a very comprehensive framework for modernizing the urban tree canopy in the Commonwealth. It's unusual to read well-written legislation. Most of it is pretty poorly written. And, there are thousands of bills before the legislature, but I've read dozens of them for this session. And this was the best written one that I came across. And so, I'm encouraged by the fact that it lays out a very comprehensive framework for doing this, but that it's also not what's called an unfunded mandate, that it has a funding mechanism built into it that will ensure its implementation, which is very critical for a bill. So I want to congratulate you on working on this bill, and I want you to let folks know how they can find the bill, how they can read it, and if they want to support the bill, what they can do right now to help support this bill and give it what's called traction on Beacon Hill, and then what's the next step for this legislation as far as the effort to get it passed.
So thank you so much, Glenn, for your very kind words. I have a confession to make, which is that I'm a retired lawyer. I spent most of my career working for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, actually drafting legislation at the state and federal level. So, I have like 30 years of experience in writing legislation. So this was not an accident, that I kind of know how you structure the things and how you do legislation speak. And the different, and I thought it was really, really important in this bill to lay out its purpose, which is not often done in Massachusetts legislation. You see that more often in Congress. But if you lay out the purpose of this legislation is to treat all these very specific things, then it makes it really clear what the legislative intent is. And it makes it much easier for people who are implementing the bill to have clear direction about what it is that they need to do. And I also know that effective legislation also has to have a good executive branch component to make sure that there are people there are agencies who are responsible for making it happen. Because if you don't, otherwise there's words on a paper, but you don't have anybody driving it to make it happen. So we thought really carefully about how to put those pieces together. With respect to how people can help on this bill.
I have a link they could go to, Marilyn. So the Gas Leaks Allies has a page. You can go to gasleaksallies.org and go to where the section says current legislation. And there's a bunch of bills that the Gas Leaks Allies is working on. If you scroll down, you'll find it linked to not only directly to the bills, it's S504 and H905, but a couple of things about the bill, some high-level bullet points, and then a link to a fact sheet that we pulled together that gives you an overview. We don't know when the hearing's going to be, do we, Marilyn? We think in a couple of weeks.
You know, we'll get about a week's notice, but I think, and to Glenn's point, the thing that people can really do to be helpful is first ask your representative and your senator to co-sponsor the bills. The lead sponsor in the Senate is Senator Cream, and the lead sponsor in the legislature is Lori Elric. And it makes a big difference for multiple members of the legislature to sign on to say they support the bill. It helps the committee take it more seriously. And then really, really important is to pack the room, which will certainly be on Zoom, so you don't have to make the trek into Boston and get to standing room only on a hot day because it's always hot, even in the wintertime in those rooms, because you have Zoom, and it's an opportunity for a wide variety of people to testify. So you have, and we will organize it so that there are panels and you can get your voice heard so that you don't have to not understand how this process is going to work. So if you're really interested in testifying, then you should send me an email if you like. It's at Marilyn Ray, MARILYNRAY @AOL.com, and we'll make sure that you get instructions on how to testify.
Yep. Or you could go to, I see here also gasleaksallies@gmail.com for those of you who can't remember Marilyn's email because you're in the car. It's gasleaksallies@gmail. That might be an easier one to remember. Yeah, email us and we'll definitely put you in touch and keep you in the loop. You know, we also had a great webinar a couple of weeks ago. Just one quick thing, and then Glenn, and then back to you. But I really think that this bill meets the moment, right? I mean, we have so many challenges in this country, and I think the idea of an urban forestry bill meets the moment, the challenge that we face, which is about not just climate change, but also climate justice, about racial equity, but all the intersections around climate change and the people whose lives are going to be affected. So the way that this legislation is written is really intentional about focusing first and foremost around environmental justice communities.
So what I'm hearing you say is, for right now, folks can contact their own state legislators, so their representative and senator, and they can find that information on malegislature.gov if they don't know who they're represented by.
Yeah, and you know, Glenn, to David's point, this is also, about it being a climate bill, and it is in the sense of carbon capture, which we're always talking about here in Western Mass regarding the state forests and all. It's an important point.
Yes. Well, I saw a presentation recently that estimated that it could be as much as 10 to 20% of the carbon capture that is possible by forests could come from urban areas. And this kind of a bill would really amplify that effect and jumpstart it in the Commonwealth.
And I just want to say, one thing that this bill does is not only carbon capture, but carbon reduction. So think on a hot summer day, people aren't turning on their air conditioners often, and you're actually reducing the load on the grid, which, as we know about Shave the Peak, those are the hours where the grid is pumping out the most carbon dioxide. So, it's a win-win across, saving people money, reducing carbon released and then capturing carbon.
To the hearing process, people are often intimidated by the legislature. You have 3 minutes. You don't have to use all the 3 minutes. It's a very simple process, and we can help organize panels so that it'll be orderly. You'll know where you are in the queue and likely to be called on, so that you don't have to sit there for 2 hours worrying. And it makes a tremendous difference to have people from all over the state and people from a variety of different perspectives. And we have heard since we've started working on this bill that a lot of concern about cutting down trees on private property. And this bill doesn't deal with that, but it will raise awareness in communities about the value of trees and I think be a big jump start to a lot of local tree committees. And many of you may be on tree committees. That's vital to get resolutions from your city council or your town meeting or your select board in support of this bill, because it's resources to the municipalities and really also technical expertise, not just money, but also guidance about how to do this and make it work. And the Greening the Gateway Cities people have learned a great deal. But one of the things that we've also learned is that most cities their biggest loss of tree canopy is on private property, not on public property, notwithstanding the fact that the gas leaks are killing the street trees. So it's this effort that everybody needs to be engaged in, because we all benefit from healthy trees. Even if there's not a tree in your yard, if there's a tree in your neighbor's yard, you benefit from it.
One quick thing I want to point out is that if for a lot of legislation, there's often opposition to legislation because of interest groups that don't want things to change. But I honestly can't anticipate that anyone would really be opposed to this bill, to 905. It just doesn't have anything for people to be opposed to. It is, like you said, it is a win-win-win all the way around. And I don't think that there's any interest group that would be opposed to it, honestly. But I guess we'll see at the hearing, but it is really important for the proponents, for the advocates for legislation to show up and express their support for legislation. That's really critical. So.
Yeah, so I thank you so much, Glenn, for inviting me in Maryland today. I just wanted to put a plug in. If people want to learn more specifically about the work we're doing in Boston, or reach out to us and learn, we also have we've been creating a mass urban roundtable, Marilyn and I, between the Gas Leaks Allies and Speak for the Trees, where we're just engaging people in a conversation around forestry across the Commonwealth. You can look us up at treeboston.org.
Excellent. Marilyn, David, thank you. Thank you so much for your activism, for your organizing, and for putting this legislation before the state legislature. Really, really an important bill. And I'm sure that all of our listeners will want to support it. So thanks again, and we'll continue to follow this. And I will certainly sign up to go to that hearing and speak, or give oral testimony and also provide written testimony in support of this bill. So
Yeah,
thank you.
good work, you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Glenn, for your enthusiasm and support. It means a great deal.
Yes.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
That was good.
Yeah, the forest protection bills are pretty much no-brainers. There's so much common sense associated with those that it's really hard to fathom why they wouldn't be immediately adopted. But the urban reforestation bill is, if you're involved in any kind of a tree committee, or, if you live in an urban area, this is a dream bill for urban folks. And even in rural areas, this is still kind of an amazing opportunity for us to get serious about tree protection, not just on our public forests and state parks, but the urban reforestation bill gets serious about urban forests, something that we just have not taken seriously, and we need to. So really, really great information, really good opportunity for folks to take action and bring these bills over the finish line on Beacon Hill.
Indeed.
That's it, except for one more thing.
What's that?
You got to listen.
Listen to what?
Listen to your mother.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Glenn.
Hey, this is Glenn Ayers.
And this is Dia saying adios.
All right. Take care, folks, and take action.